This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you, who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stockbroker clerked, Lady Frances Carfax disappeared, and Bruce Partington planned, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered what a commissionaire does? Or what a compositor is? Or of the difference between a stevedore and a stoker?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 375, Half Measures. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you are, as always, my better half here.
Oh, well, thank you. I thought I was about a 25% improvement, but I'll take 50%. That's
You're a 50% solution.
right.
It's pretty straight. You're 100 proof. What can I
Remember
say?
the antique advertisements for Ivory soap that was supposed to be 99 and
44
99.
100% pure. Yeah.
Yeah, 99 and 44 100% pure. It always puzzled me about that 56 the 56 100ths. I mean, what was in there
What
anyway?
are the
Was that
impurities? Yeah.
broken glass?
Rat droppings. I mean, it could be anything, really.
No, it was just mud, sand, gravel.
Exfoliants. Yes.
The motto of the Ivory Soap Company was, "We do our best and no more." This is about it. This is
I like that. I do my best and no more. I think
no
that's
more.
my
We
that's
were
my
so
teenager's
close.
Motto.
We were so close. And then they had to put out a footnote on the advertising that said, if it really troubles you, scrape off 56 100ths of the bar before you use it.
Well, and is that at the top of the bar or the bottom?
Well, now
That's the question.
They should have produced a bar actually with a little blue line in it, so you could easily.
Well, that was the
easily,
only soap that floated, in my recollection, too.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
So maybe
Pumped a lot of air into
Maybe
it.
the impurities were all down at the bottom, holding it down.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
Gravity. Oh,
gravity.
wait a minute. So this is connected to dark matter, is it? Okay, I like that.
Yeah, now
And
we're
the
really
expansion
onto it.
of the universe
I like that.
and dark energy.
Well, the energy
So
here
what you're
is
saying
getting...
is, wait a minute now.
Stop.
What you're saying is that Ivory soap was sort of naturally expanding, getting bigger and bigger, so that a bar that somebody would have bought in 1935 is probably the size of a house now. Is that what you're saying?
Such are the forces of the universe. Yes, we will ask Carl Sagan, Isaac Asimov, and Stephen Hawking to
But all these
investigate this
people
for
are
us.
gone. We can't.
Exactly.
Wait a minute. Where's my Ouija board? Hold on a second.
Oh my God!
This is a lot better conversation than the one we're about to have.
You would think. Oh, goodness. Well, this is our 375th episode, which, if you're into the official names for them, that's a terquasquicentennial.
No, that's Thanksgiving. You have turquoise.
Terquasquicentennial. That combines the 3, the quasqui, 1 1/4, and centennial. So,
Now, wait a minute. Wasn't the Quasqui one of the Native American tribes in the Midwest?
Oh boy, yes, and they invented ivory soap. So there's your answer.
No, they did not invent ivory soap.
This is an episode that kind of came to us from a very tangential reference. In Silver Blaze, there was a mention that had a half number to it, and it got us to thinking about halves in the canon. Not have-nots, but the haves, halves. And it led us to find a few examples of half numbers, and we drew some conclusions about what it might signify. So stick with us as we begin to discuss that in earnest. Right after we tell you that you can support the show via Patreon or Substack. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us keep the lights on here. And at various levels on Patreon, at least, we do have thank you gifts. After you've been a member for, I think it's 3 months, then the automated gift giving kicks in there. So we do ask you to indulge us and use your patience as we get that up and running. But just go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com if you'd just like to support us without a gift. We do have extra content for you. We do have ad-free episodes for you as supporters. And at the end of every month, we have a drawing that you're automatically entered into for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal. All worthy reasons to support us on either one of those platforms. Okay, let's fully get into this half-measured conversation, clearly a half-baked conversation at this point.
Well, then how can we fully get into it? You need to be consistent here.
All right, well, let's half get into it, and then we'll half get out of it.
Let's half get into it, and then let's get back to something important like ivory soap.
And, interestingly, as I was looking through mentions of half in the canon, I noted that there were some times when things were considered half full and half empty, and it had nothing to do with Holmes being an optimist or a pessimist. It had to do with what happened to that vessel beforehand. So, for example, the wine bottle that Holmes came upon in the Abbey Grange, he called half empty. Because, of course, the wine bottle began as full of wine, and it had been decanted for a few drinks. And then in The Hound of the Baskervilles, there was a bucket that he called half full because it had been filled with rainwater or something of the sort. So that's just an interesting observation there about calling something half full or half empty based on what most recently happened to it.
But you're not drawing a conclusion about optimism or pessimism on Holmes's part.
Not at all. He was half comic and wholly philosophical, as Watson called him. Which was so. Does that mean that he was 1.5? Because it doesn't seem that there's room for both to be half comic and wholly philosophical.
Well, no, but now you're talking about gravity again. I don't know that this is where we...
This is grave.
This is like, you can't spend a lot of time on the weak forces of physics.
No.
But look, what we're talking about here is faux precision, which is perfectly appropriate since many of our conversations are about faux scholarship. But your point, I think, is a good one here in that it tells us something about Holmes. That he uses these terms sometimes, and you've got some great examples here to make an impression about his own skill and analytical ability, or otherwise influence the person that he's talking to.
Yeah, that's right. And when you this is kind of like when you hear somebody quoting statistics. And if they say, half of people believe such and such, versus saying 87.3% of people believe such and such, well, you're more likely to believe that more precise number because it sounds more studied and more, scientifically derived rather than someone just throwing off a whole number or a random number.
Yeah. Well, and there are lots of examples, in our own daily experience. I mean, you will occasionally find people quoting excessively precise measurements and sort of everyday things. So, for example, I just took my child to the doctor and the child weighs 7.3 pounds. Well, yeah, but the scale only measures in whole pounds. So. Or sometimes people do this, using specific numbers, as you just suggested, to make subjective claims sound very objective. This movie is 84% perfect. But it's my personal opinion, and this sort of level of objective measurement doesn't really exist. And then in politics, you see it all the time. You have people saying, yes, my approval rating is 2.7% higher.
Getting up there.
And then the margin of error in the poll is 5%. So.
Right. So you're saying you might have a negative approval rating. You might have a negative 2.5% approval rating.
Right. And then one of the things I do all the time, unconsciously, is I'll say something like, oh, I'll be there in 2.5 minutes. Well, I really have no real idea of how long it will take me to do whatever, it is I'm talking about. But for some reason I say, just give me half a second. I'm going to be right there. And it's completely meaningless.
No, I love it when you sound like you know what you're talking about.
Well, it's rare. That's why you love it. Yeah.
So one of these instances occurs early on in the canon, Scandal in Bohemia. This is the first short story. It's our first view into Baker Street since the Sign of the Four, when Watson found the love of his life. He was often married, and now in Scandal in Bohemia, he's visiting Baker Street. And he walks in, and Holmes and Watson says, with hardly a word spoken, but with a kindly eye, he waved me to an armchair, threw across his case of cigars, and indicated a spirit case and gasogene in the corner. Then he stood before the fire and looked me over in his singular, introspective fashion. Wedlock suits you, he remarked. I think, Watson, you've put on 7.5 pounds since I saw you. 7, I answered. Indeed, I should have thought a little more, just a trifle more, I fancy, Watson.
Yes.
And this is ridiculous. I mean, first of all, to say 7 pounds instead of maybe 5 or 10, but then 7.5 and quibble over the half pound. Yeah. This is
if Watson had any sense, he would have said, "Well, I'm wearing heavy socks today."
Right.
It's probably the knitting that gives you that. But it's my ankles, I think, that suggest that to you.
I'm positively edematous, or whatever edema adjective is there.
Oh, right.
Edematic.
That would be it.
I don't know.
That would be it.
I'm retaining fluid.
Well, later on, too, in Scandal in Bohemia, this sort of drops into Holmes's conversation. There's a point where he's talking about his experiences. He's disguised himself as this groom, and he's done this, that, and the other thing, and he's talking to Watson. And he says something like, I got a lot of information about Irene Adler, but also I got a lot of information about half a dozen other people in the neighborhood in whom I was not in the least interested, but I had to listen to all of this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And, it's a little generalization there.
Yeah. And that level of precision sounds more informed than if he said a few or a handful of.
Yeah, or a couple,
but the point is made. So already in the opening here, we're having Holmes demonstrating the superiority of his deductive skills and trying to impress Watson. And to me, it is reminiscent of one that takes place in the memoirs, the first story in the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, which is Silver Blaze. This famous scene where Holmes and Watson are heading on a train to King's Pyland out toward Dartmoor. And Watson says, an hour or so later, I found myself in the corner of a first-class carriage flying along en route to Exeter, while Sherlock Holmes, with his sharp, eager face framed in his ear-flapped traveling cap, dipped rapidly into the bundle of fresh papers which he had procured at Paddington. We had left Reading far behind us before he thrust the last one of them under his seat and offered me his cigar case. "We're going well," said he, looking out the window and glancing at his watch. "Our rate at present is 53.5 miles an hour." And Watson, of course, says, "Well, I haven't observed the quarter-mile posts." And Holmes says, "Nor have I, but the telegraph posts on this line are 60 yards apart, and the calculation is a simple one." Well, there have been umpteen Sherlockian scholars who have, there have been half a dozen Sherlockian scholars who have attempted to do the math to convert yards to miles per hour. And you can do it, obviously. You can do it on paper, but it is an extraordinarily complex calculation to do even on paper, let alone to do in one's head. So here's Holmes saying 53.5 miles an hour. What conclusion are we to draw from that, do you think?
Well, I think to the point that you made earlier here, which is that, things like faux precision like this can be used intentionally and unintentionally, so that the person you're speaking to, you will sound more knowledgeable or confident to the person you are speaking to. But it could also be used, to mislead people. And, it could be that there are points in the canon where Holmes actually uses this sort of faux precision to mislead somebody. But it's, it's an indication of, well, it could be one of two things. One is it could be Holmes is far ahead of even contemporary mathematical analysis about this. And in fact, he was exactly right. It could also be that he just introduced it into conversation to, suggest a ballpark answer or, simply to end a subject and get on to something else. Oh, it's a simple calculation. And now let's talk about something else.
And I think knowing that Watson would be at a disadvantage, I mean, who's to say that Holmes is wrong? Would Watson have whipped out his slide rule and said, well, no, Holmes, actually, it's 57 miles an hour?
Yes, I think more like 58, Holmes. Yes.
I mean,
if only he had been traveling not with Dr. Watson, but Professor Moriarty, they could have had a real...
Well, there you go. The former mathematics professor makes perfect sense, which leads us to, I think, another great example in the final problem. You want to take that one?
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, that's a great one because here, Holmes is introducing Professor Moriarty to Watson. Although we could certainly have a whole other episode about exactly when Professor Moriarty is actually introduced to Watson. But for the sake of argument, let's say that this is an early description of Professor Moriarty to Dr. Watson. And Holmes says, quite famously, he's the organizer of half that is evil and nearly all that is undetected. And I don't know that enough people have paid really attention to that statement. Well, okay, but who's the organizer of the other half? And what's happening about all this other stuff that's undetected? But it's a very interesting statement.
That's a bold claim.
It's a bold claim. Half that is evil.
It's kind of like the famous John Wanamaker quote. I know only half of my advertising is effective, but I don't know which half.
I can't tell which half. Yeah.
So I know that Moriarty is responsible for half the evil, but I don't know which half.
Mm-hmm.
And again, broad strokes here. Who's Watson to disprove this, or who are we to not believe it? And I think the intention here is to really create this specter of influence and of evil looming over this story, which of course takes a tragic turn in the very end. This, I think, sets it up pretty well.
Yeah. Well, it also sets up the advantage to society of a sacrifice in ridding London of and England and the world of such an evil influence.
Yeah, and we're glad he could do that at a certain point. Less of an evil influence, more of an inconvenience. Let's turn to the blue carbuncle. This is there's an interesting use of half. And by the way, if you can search the Canon and you search for the word half, you will find probably somewhere between 350, 400 mentions of the word itself. But we're only interested in uses of it that tried to convey some deeper meaning. In other words, we're not looking at things that, the door was half closed or it was 6:30 or anything like that. So in this case, Holmes and Watson had just finished talking with Henry Baker, who visited Baker Street to reclaim his hat and get the replacement goose. And he had informed Holmes and Watson where he had come across his first goose. Of course, it was part of the Goose Club at the Alpha Inn. So Holmes and Watson immediately hightail it over to the Alpha Inn, and Holmes is trying to get some information out of the innkeeper. He says, "Your beer should be excellent if it is as good as your geese." And the innkeeper surprisingly said, "My geese?" Said, "Yes, I was speaking only half an hour ago to Mr. Henry Baker, who's a member of your Goose Club." Now, the use of half an hour ago in this conversation, how does that strike you, Bert?
Well, I think it's an excuse. He wants it to, he doesn't want to communicate that he's on a hunt for the goose. And so his references,
wild goose chase, you mean?
I was, right. I was just talking to this chap who mentioned it. So it's top of mind, and that's why I brought it. That's why I said it.
Yeah, I mean, there's that sense of urgency, that sense of realism there. He does a great job of getting the interest and help of the innkeeper as a result. So, okay, why don't we round the bend here and finish up with the Norwood Builder? Where do we find the half in Norwood Builder?
Well, it's a case where Holmes is confronted with an official detective who expresses, some puzzlement about figuring out the true sequence of events here. And Holmes remarks somewhat cavalierly, "Well, I could easily give you half a dozen about other theories." So Holmes, wants to either accurately project or suggest that he has done an analysis that is significantly been more fruitful than the other person's, and that he has more theories at hand that could be studied and disproved or examined and so on as potential explanations.
Yeah. And as is typical in his fashion, and this is with Lestrade that he's having this conversation. He does say, as you mentioned, they could give half a dozen, but then he proceeds to only give one. Yeah. So it's, here, let me impress you with this number, half a dozen examples, but here's the most probable one. So we'll light on that one. Instead of, kind of enumerating what each one might have been. So kind of makes you wonder whether he did have, in fact, half a dozen examples.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Well, it is fascinating. And, hopefully this is a fully baked episode rather than our typical half-baked ones.
We have to insert a spoon or a knife and see if anything sticks to the episode to make sure that it's fully cooked.
As one does with a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Watson, we're going well. Our speed at present is 53.5 miles an hour.
I've not observed the quarter-mile posts.
Nor have I. But the telegraph posts on this line are 60 yards apart. Calculation is a simple one.
We could easily do another 5 minutes. The question is, would anyone listen?
No. I'll turn up the heat to 375. That'll take care of it.
There we go. And then it becomes more than a trifle. It becomes pound cake, I guess.
Pound cake.
It's a good thing we didn't name this podcast Pound Cake. I don't think we'd get as many listeners.
Half a pound cake.
Oh,